welcome all, peace and blessing. Happy, what is today? I don't know the day of the week, but I know it's day two. And welcome to Amplify the Voices of the Global Majority Online Summit. I'm still your host, Reggie Hubbard. They still got me. And today, as always, we welcome you into this intimate space for candid conversation about healing and liberation. We're on day two. Yesterday was absolute fire. So if you're joining us today, get the recordings and look at what we went through yesterday. It was a beautiful expression of love, a beautiful expression of clarity, and a beautiful expression of truth, right? There are many things in the air these days that are focused on misinformation, that are focused on delusion, that are focused not on our mutual benefit, thriving, and transformation, focused on keeping us in place. So I'm very pleased and honored and humbled to be here on day two to take the narrative, expanding from a foundation of love into conversations of rhythm, into conversations of how we heal not just our minds, but our bodies, right? They're ancient technologies. What you see behind me is real. So all these are gongs. Like the muse and the vibration has bitten me. And like I am a servant to the muse of rhythm and spiritual percussion. So I'm very excited for our guest today, which I'll get to in a minute. But before we get there, housekeeping. Kripalu has joined forces with change makers around the globe to dismantle inequity, mitigate harm, steward the planet, prioritize our collective wellness. And I'll say this, and I always emphasize here because we're addicted to individuality, stress interdependent liberation. We're in this together. If you ain't free, I ain't free, right? So we're stressing interdependent liberation. And throughout the history of this nation, throughout the history of the world, voices of the global majority, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, have been at the forefront of breaking down barriers to systemic issues that affect both the planet and humanity while ushering in radical change. And this change is rooted in like the dispelling of delusion, the dispelling of the myths of supremacy. And, whether it has been in the instance of yoga coming to the West, or fighting all types of injustice on the front lines of society, communities of color have been vanguard and essential in that liberation movement. So, as always, our time together virtually, will require us to listen. And these times that we're in now, we need to heal historical wounds. Like, if we ain't throwing old trauma at each other, then what the hell are we doing, right? And we need to do something different. The plain Jane stuff ain't working. We need to put a little spice in here. So we enter this work in this series and beyond as an act of community care, because none of us can be well unless all of us are well. And as I said earlier, if you ain't free, I ain't free. So let's get free, right? Welcome. We love that you're here, and we love to be sharing space with you. This online summit creates a compassionate space to humanize the healing process, to explore justice as a tool for restoration, and to cultivate humility, determination, and surrender on the path of liberation and transformation. The world is worlding, y'all. Captain Obvious statement of the day. The world is worlding. We have personal and collective loss. We have climate catastrophes. We have post-pandemic recovery. We have ongoing global conflicts, and we just have so much is happening in the air. And this event, this series, invites us all to hold these gently while also exploring other pathways to healing. Together, we'll learn from ancestral practice, the solace of community, and bring in hope and joy that is required for mutual renewal. We gather today virtually in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts on the ancestral territory of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans. I currently am on the unceded territory of the Piscataway Nation in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, or I call it Anna Redneck County for reasons I'll explain in other fora. But I encourage you now to, if you know the lands where you are, please place them in the chat, because we're not here for your entertainment. We are building community. So tell us about yourself. Where are you in the world? We invite you to share with us the lands that you're on. And I would also say, what brought you to today's session, right? So don't just tell me where you at, tell me why you here, so we can learn from each other. Kripalu today stewards the lands in Massachusetts as a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to empowering people and communities to realize their full potential. We ain't living small, all big here, through the transformative wisdom and practice of yoga. Our Amplify series has been made possible because of the generous donation of donors, and we give thanks for their generosity, which makes events like this possible. I personally give thank you for your generosity of showing up, because you could have been anywhere in the world and y'all are here. So I bow to you, because we can't have a show if ain't no people, right? So thank you for being here. And in this collective space, as always, we will center our online community agreements. You have seen these agreements in correspondence prior to the summit. So thank you for reviewing the agreements and agreeing to be here. And if you haven't read them, they will be placed in the chat now. So thank you for allowing me to do the housekeeping. And I want us to have a transition to our session. And in this collective virtual circle, I used breath yesterday, but I think in honor of Brother Shaka Zulu, I'm going to center us with sound. So this bowl here, I mean, I've got 100, whatever. I'd love to know, Shaka, how many drums you got, because I got way, anyway. So this bowl here is purposefully dedicated to my ancestors. Like, this has been on my family land. This has been in the cemetery where my ancestors are buried. So as we center and come into this collective circle, we're going to take an inhale through the nose, then I'm going to play this 3 times in honor of the ancestors, in honor of the present moment, and to bless our time together. So finding a posture that is suitable for your energy, opening the heart, clearing the mind. Maybe you shrug shoulders and give yourself a little wiggle. Soften the eyes or close them, whatever is most comfortable. Do not be like this. Give the eyes a bit of a break. So feeling the feet on the ground, how might you soften into the ground? Inhale through the nose, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and pause. Exhale out the mouth. When you're ready, release the meditation. Drink back the space with this new perspective. Now, we are honored to welcome Chief Shaka Zulu. Today's program is called Rhythms of Reverence, Healing Through Spirit of the Mask and the Beat of the Drum with Chief Shaka Zulu. I'm excited to have this conversation, so let me get out of the way and offer a brief introduction. Chief Shaka Zulu is a 14th generation Congolese master drummer, storyteller, mask maker, and keeper of ancient African traditions. He leads the Zulu Connection, a New Orleans-based group of bringing West African and Afro-Indigenous spiritual tradition to life through music, movement, and mask making. Today's offering will invoke the sacred rhythms of our ancestors. We'll explore how sound, movement, and storytelling serve as instruments for healing and reverence. Shaka Zulu, welcome to our space.
Greetings, how are you?
Very well. Chief Shaka Zulu, pardon me. Thank you for your wisdom, and I yield the floor to you.
Yes, I'm very excited this morning that we have some folk that's interested in today's activities. So I'm ready to get started whenever you are.
The floor is yours.
Gotcha. Okay, today I'm here to share my personal as well as my spiritual experiences as a practitioner to this wonderful culture that we call the New Orleans Indigenous Masking Societies. And when I say society, I'm speaking of many different cultures that was and still now indigenous to this place that we call Louisiana. Um, So I'll start with the history of the culture of New Orleans as it relates to the indigenous mass societies. And I want to clarify some things about that. When I say the name indigenous, I'm mainly speaking to cultural societies that I'm a part of, that's based in New Orleans, and the origin is New Orleans, and it was born and raised in New Orleans. And I'm speaking mainly of the people of African descent that were here pre-Columbus. And that's what I mean by native New Orleanians. And I wanted to clear that up because a lot of folk confuse that with quote unquote Native Americans, which this culture was before Louisiana was a part of America. So as it relates to the native culture here, we speaking of native people here. And even Native Americans want to be called by the nation name, just to give respect to that culture as well. So we speaking of those nations that were here that look like us. In today's societies, you may see things that are online that may confuse you a little bit. So I'm here to clear up that narrative as it relates to Native Americans, that we call Native Americans today in the societies. So this culture is mainly about when Europeans arrived here. Don't get it twisted. When the Europeans came here, there were people here, and not only that, there were people here. We had a culture, and our culture was relevant. And as it relates to the transatlantic slave trade, not all of us got here through the slave trade. Some of us were already here. And not only that we were here, we had a culture. So we speaking of about 1619, where the first ships came from the continent of Africa. But as it relates to Louisiana, most folk through the transatlantic slave trade didn't get here till 1719. We had 3 ships that came here. One was called the Du Lac du Maine. One was called the Aurora, which means the dawn. And there's another ship was called Ouida, that was named after a place that you'll find in Benin today. So those came directly to Louisiana in 1719, which is 100 years later after the first ships arrived in 1619 in St. Augustine, Florida, and Virginia, and things of that nature. So what I'm saying is there was folk already here, may have been here 500 to 1,000 years before the transatlantic. So I'm speaking of those native folk that we call Louisiana, and back then it was West Florida before the Louisiana Purchase. So that's what this presentation is mainly about. Just clearing up some of the narrative and the history, because people put us in this, this really, really broad sense of culture, and culture is very spiritual and very specific to culture bearers or culture keepers. So I just wanted to make sure that that was part of the clarity that I want to bring to this experience today. So upon arrival of the Europeans, and I'm mainly speaking of the French, there were folk here that were enslaved by the French. And eventually that slavery was very, very harsh, and people didn't live very long. And so that brought it to the sense of saying that we may need to go elsewhere to find people to bring to this part of the world to enslave them as well. So that's where I get to the decision to bring Africans to this continent. And when I speak of Africa, many books will tell you that it was from a specific region that they brought them here to to Louisiana. And what we find throughout our travels is that it wasn't just the Senegambian region that a lot of the books will say, because we've been as far east as Tanzania or Tanzania, some people may say, and went into the dungeons in the basement of the Catholic churches, and you'll find history that people came as far east as Tanzania to Louisiana. And we've personally experienced that ourselves. And you go to the belly of Africa, which is Central Africa, Congo, Angola, and we have a place here still that they call Angola, and they put a state penitentiary on the grounds of the indigenous folk that escaped from this part of New Orleans and went to that part of Louisiana. And they called it Angola back then, but now it's another name that they have. But there's a state penitentiary on those burial grounds, which Angola was the name of the kingdom of Congo. So it brings me to the point of there were people from Central Africa that came to Louisiana, Congo. So once again, it wasn't just that Senegamian region. So the enslavement by the French had a lot to do with a system that they set up that they had done elsewhere. And so we want to make sure that that system was brought to this part. And it was called a Code Noir, which was set up in 1724. But actually, it was based on a system that they set up in Martinique in 1685, right? So they basically used that same system that they brought to Louisiana that's called a Code Noir. In French, it means black code, right? And it was a system that was set up that was articles that they considered laws. And it was over 50. I think it was about 53 articles under the Code Noir, but it was only a few of them that was very personal to us, us African people that was born in New Orleans. And one was you had to be Catholic under the Code Noir. And that's why Louisiana is probably the largest concentration of Catholics as African Americans in the country, because under the Code Noir, as African Americans, we had to be Catholic. The other article, a law that stood out for us was the Sunday being the entire day dedicated to church, right? So on Sundays, you couldn't work your workers. So for us, as Africans born in New Orleans, that became a free day. And that land that was kind of like swampland because the entire city was the French Quarter. And outside of the Rampart, which is Rampart Street now, they had this swampland that they call Congo Square. And you may see it referred in books as Beauregard Square. And that was sacred grounds for some of the nations that was indigenous to Louisiana. But it was the Houma Nation that did the annual green corn harvest festival in what we call Congo Square today. So now it's on the books is Louis Armstrong Park, but there's a section in that park that Congo Square was the sacred grounds of the Houma Nation, which was one of the many nations that was indigenous back then. So no work on Sundays, which meant that we were able to gather in Congo Square as African people. So because we consider that as a free day. And in that gathering, we didn't have drums because during the transatlantic slave trade, they took the drums because we were speaking a language on the drums. But on Sunday in Congo Square, we were able to make replicas of drums that we brought or we had in our homelands. So we would take pegs and barrels and rum barrels and things of that nature, or we would carve the oak trees and we would create drums because we had to ritualize some of the stuff that we did at home that we brought to this land to remind us of home. And so you have people from many different regions of Africa, and they gather together, and you see the circle of tile work on the ground, because in Africa, that trinity, which is music, song, and dance, is one. And we call it our African trinity, so to speak. So you don't do one without the other, but we gather in circles. And that's why you see that circle of tile work on the ground. And we call those circles bantaba, mean a circle of gathering of music, song, and dance to kind of do our spiritual work. And so we did it, and that's where the term drum circle come from. People would drum in a circle, and that term drum circle come from an African tradition that we call a bantaba, where we did our ceremonies in circles. Fridays was auctions a lot of times, and we have a sacred tree in Congo Square that they did the auctions under. So now on Sundays, we still have drum circles, and we kind of like use that tree as an altar. So still today in New Orleans, people will come there and, do a certain blessing under that tree that we call the sacred tree. And it was also a time where relationship building in Congo Square, where you had nations that, from different parts of the world of Africa and then we had people that was indigenous here that was part of those gatherings. And then the Europeans came to those gatherings because we were playing drumming and singing and dancing, and they looked at that gathering as entertainment. So Europeans came to that gatherings, and sometimes they brought European instruments, like the horns and stuff like that. And then that created a whole new tradition in New Orleans that was born out of Congo Square that we call jazz. It was the African drum that came together with those European horns that came up with this unique traditional music that we call jazz here in New Orleans, that eventually became rock and roll, and from rock and roll, so on, all the other music. So New Orleans was where all of that stuff culturally, as it relates to music of America or African American music, the origin has to go to New Orleans, and that space was Congo Square. And there was another event that was very, very important to New Orleans, and we call that event the Haitian Revolution on the island of Hispaniola. Back then, you have to realize that the French that came to Louisiana, or New Orleans, should I say, because back then the crops that was indigenous to Louisiana were the indigo, the coffee, the tobacco, the green corn, of course. But the French brought in the sugar, because remember, sugar was like a very, very powerful commodity around the world that was traded. So most of those crops that they had in New Orleans or Louisiana, they also did the same thing on the island of Hispaniola, which we call Haiti today. They also did the same thing in Brazil today. So that gathering of folk that came together to rebel against what was happening from the French perspective on that island, that we call the Haitian Revolution, started in 1791, and eventually went all the way on to 1803. So they burned down those crops, they burned down the sugar plantations and things of that nature, and that affected the economy in New Orleans, right? So when that happened, it forced the French to sell. And that sale became the Louisiana Purchase, which was very, very interesting because there's not many books on it, and it's not much history that's been documented on it. But that was one of the biggest revolutions of the history of revolutions around the world. So it forced the French to sell, and that sale was really was supposed to have been about the port of Orleans at the time, but they wanted everywhere that Mississippi went. So that sale became other states involved. It was over 800,000 miles of land. And also they were supposed to sell to to the British, but they sold it to the Americans. And that was a very, very important thing that happened because it doubled the size of America. And also, at some point, it made Louisiana a part of America, right? So that was a very, very powerful thing, the Haitian Revolution that happened. And it also brought people of Haitian descent to Louisiana, because they went to other parts of the Caribbean and they were kicked out because that was a very, very powerful revolution. So they wanted to make sure that that didn't happen in other parts of the world. So they were kicked out of different parts of the Caribbean, and eventually a lot of them came to Louisiana. And to have fact about that quote, they did the same thing in Louisiana. Once Louisiana became occupied and the population doubled because of the Haitian Revolution, there was someone of Haitian descent. His name was Charles Delon or Charles Deslon, that he organized a revolt right here in Louisiana called the 1811 slave revolt, which is really documented on the books here in Louisiana, but you may not find it in other parts of the United States. But that was a very large revolt as well that happened on American soil, which was very powerful. And I think it has a lot to do with some of the blocks of cultural expression as it relates to African Americans being born in New Orleans still today, because they eventually did the same thing right here in New Orleans, called the Haitian Revolt. Now, there was a number of things that happened as it relates to the culture of this masculine tradition that we have here in New Orleans. We have the Maroons, and when the treaties were signed and all of that stuff happened back then, not everybody agreed to that. And not everybody took a number and went to the reservations as it relates to the indigenous folk here in Louisiana. Some people fought for the land. Some people ran off into the Maroons, which are areas that most enslaved people ran to for refuge. And some people were already there that they occupied that land even back then, many years before the Europeans came to what we call New Orleans today. And those areas were also communities that were already here, and there were sacred communities. So when those folk who fought for the land, eventually after the ships started coming to Louisiana of African descent, people coming here, when they rebelled, they ran off into those maroon communities with their cousins, right? And their cousins who had been here many, many years before the transatlantic, they would bring them in and house them and hide them from the slave masters, right? So families were created with those situations. We saw the similar set of values as it relates to cultural values that we brought from the continent of Africa, and they still held those same values in those maroon communities. So it brought us to the fact that we realized that we had our people here that was many years before we got here on the ships during the transatlantic slave trade. So that's where we're saying that we're paying the homage to those native Louisiana people, which kind of causes some confusion to some people. But once again, we can clear those confusions up because we have a great deal of respect for quote unquote Native Americans here. That's a part of that narrative, that's a part of American history. So the way that we paid homage was to create some of the same cultures that was already here many years before the transatlantic slave trade. So we started these groups that we call nations, right? And we couldn't do Mardi Gras during the time of European Mardi Gras in the French Quarter with Europeans because once again, slavery was still going on. Because Mardi Gras, you talking about that history being what, 1853 was the beginning of this quote unquote Mardi Gras season in New Orleans, and slavery was still going on during that time. So we couldn't do Mardi Gras with Europeans. We had to create our own masking tradition that we can have our carnival processions in the streets in New Orleans during that time, because we didn't want to have to get a permit from the city. So we created our own situations here that we call carnival. And still today, I've never done Mardi Gras with Europeans in the French Quarter. And I'm 56 years old. There's a whole bunch of African-centered carnival traditions that's done in the city. We utilize European holidays to mask our African carnival traditions in the streets and the neighborhoods, because we didn't want to have to get a permit from the city. So everybody was in the French Quarter during that time, and we were able to freely express our carnival traditions in our neighborhoods. So it's the same day as Mardi Gras, different part of town, right? So most people that come here for Mardi Gras, if you're of African descent that comes, more than likely you're a tourist, because there's a whole nother carnival celebration that's going on in the African-American communities at that time. So we set those societies up, and it was 3 parts to it that we based it on. One was masking. And masking is an African tradition. Once you put a mask on, you're not a person anymore. You become the energy of the entity of what it is that you're masking. So that's what we call it. The other part is called procession. You taking that mask and you putting it on, and you processioning in the streets, in the neighborhoods of New Orleans, in your communities, right? The other part that's the most important part of this tradition is called the ritual. The ritual is taking a year-long process and hand beating these suits. And we don't call them costumes, we call them suits, because it's spiritual beads, prayer beads. It's actually taking those beads and you creating a theme to those beads in that ritual, and you applying it to create these suits. And it takes a year-long process to hand bead a suit. So once you mask in that suit that year, you can't wear it or mask in it again. So it's a one-time experience, because the ritual is really about the paying of the homage to our folk that hid us from the transatlantic slave trade. So that ritual was the most important part to it. So now we came up with nation names. There's over 42 nations in the city still today. And the first nation that we have is Goldenfeather Nation, which I'm the chief of. But there's also nation names that we came up, like the Young Maasai Hunters. And that name came to a group, a nation that's a great friend of mine who passed away at a very young age. And we go out into Tanzania every year, my wife and I, and we do sewing experiences with the Maasai as well as the Meru people. So he wanted me to bring a cloth from Tanzania to him. So I brought a Maasai cloth back. And he was leaving one nation and joining another, starting his own nation. So I gave him the name, the Young Maasai Hunters, that I'm glad I did, because, he passed away, and those memories still stick with me, because he was a very dear friend to me. And we have groups like Creole Wild West, Wild Magnolias, which eventually that group became a band. And that's why you're starting to see us not destroy suits anymore, because Mardi Gras is Fat Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday. So we sold suits all the way up to Carnival Day. We mask in it, and then Ash Wednesday, we destroy the suit, right? But we don't do that anymore, because eventually those bands will travel and they will play music and they would talk sing about this tradition in those songs, and people didn't know what they were referring to. So they kept the suit because they wanted the visuals of some of the lyrics that they were singing. So now they stopped destroying the suits and start wearing, keeping those suits to wear with those bands when they travel the world. And also museums and things of that nature, they would want to know about this tradition. So they start saving suits to do exhibits in museums and galleries. And so they kind of stopped destroying the suits in the early 50s. And they started keeping, you can't ask them again, right? So when we started those nations, it was about the geographical location of the town that you were from. Uptown and downtown, we have this street called Canal Street, and that's the Mason-Dixie line. Anything south of Canal Street going to the river is called uptown. Anything north of Canal Street going to the lake is downtown. So uptown styles of sewing was different. Their style was, we had the ostrich feather, which is an African bird. They would pluck it and they have plumes, right? Their designs, well, their work is called patches. So they would bead this patch on canvas. They would draw a picture, and the picture would tell a story. And in the storyline, they would have a lot of native theme in there, in their work. And their work is flat. And the beading styles we brought from the continent, like the Yoruba style of beading that comes from Nigeria. And we in some styles it was the Ndebele from South Africa, or you can go as far east as Tanzania and you see the Maasai style of beading. So it was many different African styles of beading forms that you find in the uptown style of sewing. And then there was the downtown style. Oh, I'll just give you an example of some of the uptown style sewing that you see on the streets. As you see, there's a lot of Native American theme in some of the uptown suits, because their narrative has been brought to them as it relates to what was going on during that time. So you'll find Native theme, and sometimes that's confused with confuses Native Americans, quote unquote. Downtown style of sewing, which was started in the early 50s. It was one chief that decided he were being downtown, since we rival other groups by geographical location of the city, he wanted to create his own style of sewing that we call a downtown style. So the difference in uptown and downtown is, remember, uptown is flat. They use plumes. They call their work patches. They would draw a picture on the canvas that tell a story, and it would bead that picture. And they would have this velvet technique around their patch that distinctly describe their stuff differently. Downtown style is three-dimensional style of sewing. We don't call our work patches. We call our work designs, which mean, or self-sculpture, which means a piece that sits on a piece that sits on a piece. So it's three-dimensional. It protrudes off the suit. And the themes in the downtown style of sewing is African theme or abstract theme or Caribbean theme. And when we say Caribbean, we mainly speaking of Haiti, because remember, during that revolution, most people came to Louisiana and brought their culture with them, the Haitian culture with them. And they had this flag that most people call Veve flags, but actually the Veves are the symbols that are in the flags. But the name of the flag is called Drapeau. And they use a lot of sequin work in their art design. So in a downtown style of sewing, you see a lot of sequin work. And that's paying homage basically to our Haitian brothers that came here and brought that flag to Louisiana. So you find a lot of that culture that's in a downtown style of sewing with the sequin. We don't use the ostrich uh, feather called a plume. We use the American bird, which is the turkey feather that we call quills. So you find a lot of quills in the suits. And we have marabou, which come off the ostrich. Actually, is off the neck of the ostrich. They do this little process where they create these marabous, which is like boas, right? Or hackle feather we use, and that goes around our pieces. We don't use the velvet technique around our designs. We use the marabou or the hackle around the designs. So that's what makes our work a little bit different. As you can see, I'm working on one of the theme suits that I have actually at Leaf Festival. There's a room there that have that suit that I broke down to use as an educational device to to bring that culture around the country. So you can see when we created these nations, we were war against each other, and the wars were very intense, and it was based on the battles of who did the most tenure of the work in the ritual, which is the sewing, the entourage, and the songs and the music, and so that's what those was about. So we had positions in the gangs or the nations that those positions had specific roles. So the first position you'll find is the spy, right? He's 3 blocks out front the nation, and he's the eyes of the nation. And each nation would have signals that they would send because the chief is all the way in the back, so he can't see 3 blocks out front. So that spy position would send those signals back to the chief and the rest of the nation on what it is that we should do, because we will meet each other and battle each other, and they will battle by positions. And it's like a chess match. They're trying to get to the king or the chief, right? And that's during the processions on Carnival Day, right? We will have these processions that come out. I'm sorry, I didn't say that in the beginning. So that spy was a very position. A lot of times he's light, even though it's a lot of bead work, but he's not that heavy because he have to do a lot of running back and forth. So you see the spy. Mhm. The other position is called a flag, right? And I love this position because before I became a chief, the nation I was in, I ran flag for about 13 years. So I kind of studied that position really well. Now the chief is all the way in the back. He can't see the spy 3 blocks out front. So the flag has to be the chief eyes. So the spy will run and send the signals to the flag, and he would give those signals to the chief by using his staff. He will always have a staff, and a lot of times he will have the name of his nation on the staff. So 3 blocks away, you know what nation it is because you can see this big staff in the air, and then we decide whether we want to meet that nation and battle them. But that flag would be the eyes of the chief. Do we want to meet him? He would send that signal, or do you want to go around him? So you see the flag right here. So that's an example of the flag, right? Wow, man. What? Like, now he's wow, the craziest guy in the nation, right? But his role is very, very important because if anything happens to any of the folk, it's the wild man fault because he's supposed to be the protector, as well as the intimidator. So he's dressed wild and crazy, and his suit, the wild because he's the least elaborate, and he would have these bull horns or deer antlers or something, or a blade or something that's very known to intimidate on his suit. And but no one should meet the chief except the chief. So the spy would always meet the spy. The flag will always meet a flag. And the wild would always meet a wild, but also the wild role is to clear the pathway so those positions can meet each other. Because once that pathway is clear, that becomes sacred grounds, right? So that's what the wild position is about. Be the clearer of the pathway and the protector of the nation. Um, so that's what that position is very much about. And as you can see, he has a blade as the wild. So he's about to clear the pathway for me to meet another chief. You see how he does this motion of clearing the pathway, and everybody backs up and they clear out. And a lot of photographers get caught up in that because they see that empty space and they want to get in and take pictures, and a lot of times they will snatch him out. Now the pathway is clear, as you can see. The other position is called a medicine man, right? So you out there in 100-pound suits as a chief, um, 6, 7 hours of the day. So somebody had to be had to study the earth and the herbs and the gatu cola, the sarsaparilla, the ginseng, everything that gave you energy. He would have those potions for you to take. Also, he's the spiritual medicine for the nation. He gives you that type of spiritual energy as well. So our medicine man is very, very strong. And it's only a few medicine men out there because it's 42 nations, but you might have 3 medicine men. Nobody wants to run that position because nobody wants to study anymore. But that's the medicine man role. Or it can be a medicine woman, either or. And that's the role of that position. The queens are very, very important, even though it's a male-dominated look-like culture, but the queens are very, very important. If you look at societies, the way that you tell whether a society is healthy is by its condition of its women and children. That's anywhere in the world. So if you want to know how a society looks, look at the condition of its women and children. And if they're in trouble, the society is in trouble. So that's a very, very important tradition for us, is to make sure the health and well-being of its women and children is healthy, because that determines how long or how well your culture will live. So the women, a lot of times, they come up with the color schemes, or they just creates the balance of what's happening on Carnival Day to make sure that things doesn't get out of control as it relates to it. Because it's a lot of egos. You took a year to make a suit, and 100-pound suit, and you battling another chief, and it can get kind of hectic because if you lose the battle, you have to what they call bow down on the ground to this chief that defeats you. And there's no self-proclaimed winners. The crowd or the folk would say who won, and then you have to what they call bow, right? So it's a very, very powerful thing that happens. It's a lot of energy out there. So sometimes the women have to harness that energy with their female presence. And so the queens are very important. And there's the queens that are young. If you see, that's near my daughter. She was my queen because in a tradition, everybody makes their own suit. So most queens of a chief is not his wife, because if you choose your wife as a queen, she has to help you on your suit. So you're losing a helper on your suit because she's going to be making her own suit. So nobody wants their wife to be their queen, because you don't want to lose a sore on your suit, because these suits are very intense when you become a chief and you want to win those battles. So it's always somebody else's wife or somebody else's family member that's a female, or for many years for us, it was my daughter until she got, up in age to a teenager and went to boarding school and get too cool to do it. So I lost her. And eventually I had to have another queen until Queen Naima, big queen, stepped in the picture. So that's the queen's roles usually. They organize the sewing parties we have. Sometimes you get behind and you want to have a party where you bring a whole bunch of people in to help you sew and bring food and stuff like that, where you can get a lot of stuff done in one day. We don't do them too much no more because people would drink and they get too drunk to sew. So sewing parties for us is not beneficial to us because we lose a lot of time. So that's a queen, example of a queen. Um, and it also beautifies the culture. And a chief role is very, very, self-explanatory. He runs the day-to-day operation, or she runs the day-to-day operation of the game or the nation, teaches the history of that nation or the traditions and the crafts, and that's the most elaborate suits that you see. He have the big old hats, we call them the big old crowns, and so you know a chief when you see one. He's going to have the most elaborate stuff on, and he's all the way in the back with the women and children to make sure that the women and children are safe. So that's a suit I wore back in the day. I use Egyptians as a theme a lot because it's a lot of material. And I tell you about Egypt, study the culture of Kemet before it was, named Egypt and went into the temples and stuff like that. So I did about 5 or 6 suits on that culture because it's so much material. But I'm meeting another chief that I respect a lot. And I'm the chief that's in the mask because I come from a masking society, African tradition, stilt dancing. So for many years, my suits had a mask because I didn't want it to be about me. I wanted to be about the work that you see. And so I just stopped wearing a mask because people can't hear me in the mask and you're trying to give instructions to the rest of the nation. So I had to like open my face up, but I felt very uncomfortable coming from many, many years of masking tradition. And it's the New Orleans masking tradition, which is a no-brainer of why I got into New Orleans masking. So I'm meeting another chief. That's a Shango suit, which is Orisha. That's in the Yoruba tradition of Nigeria. And that's some of the traditions that I'm a part of. My head is Shango, so of course I had to do a Shango suit. That's my second Shango suit. And I'm meeting another chief who was the friend I was just talking about, young Messiah Hunter, who passed away. So we have a lot of respect for each other. And this is Fayaya, which is one of the most prominent African center chiefs. He masked for 59 years. He just retired this year. So, great deal of respect. And the red suit you see me in with the mask is my first Shango suit, actually. So the other one you saw was volume 2. So you see how the meetings go on the streets. Once the wild clear the pathway. Very intense. Music, song, chants, dance. It's real. And then we always embrace after who was declared the winner of the battle. But in this sense, the young protege versus the old master, of course, nobody bows down, nobody whom bow, because we just have too much respect for one another. So, and then it's just as a bonus tracks of stuff that you see on the streets of New Orleans. And it's a very, very powerful tradition of self-taught, self-displaying, and we funded ourselves. It's a very, very, and it's getting more popular. So it's a lot of attention brought to this culture nowadays. You know my name. How you know my name? Okay, so that was the conclusion of that presentation. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions that I'm very excited to be able to answer if I have the answer to it.
Chief Shaka Zulu, thank you so much for the wisdom, for the I personally didn't know because they don't teach it in my part of the world the significance of the Haitian Revolution. So it makes sense now as you articulated that that was so powerful that that forced the Louisiana Purchase. Like, but no one ever put those dots together. So the history nerd in me thanks the wisdom steward in you. Thank you for that. And one question that I have before we open it up to other questions from other folks, and y'all don't be shy, we got plenty of time, is that talk to me a little bit about how this work provides healing for the people, and how it heals communities in the healing aspect of the work.
Well, for us, not being a part of Mardi Gras was almost a blessing because if you look at the tradition of Mardi Gras, you have the mask, right? That mask represent those parties that they used to have from those cruise perspectives. And it was so much stuff going on at the parties that they didn't want people to have, you know, information on to where they would wear a mask because it was very prominent people at those parties, like judges and sometimes elected officials. And so the stuff that was going on at those parties, they would have to wear a mask so people wouldn't find out who they are, right? So that's the concept of the whole mask as it relates to Mardi Gras.
Right,
Also, Mardi Gras is a very powerful um, uh, decadence situation to where culturally you didn't want your children to be there or
right,
anybody that had any kind of moral compass.
right, right.
When you go to Bourbon Street on Mardi Gras, if you ever experience it or want to, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about.
Anything goes, yeah.
So, so the blessing was really being able to have our own celebrations in our own town, in our own part of town, which was
Hmm.
to us, right?
Right,
And
right, right, right,
the
right.
important part, that meditation of taking a little year-long process and sewing these suits, because that sewing is meditation to
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
And I don't care what it is you're doing, to do it for a year-long process,
That's spiritual
it's very spiritual.
for sure.
A lot of stuff goes on without in a whole year's time. What you start with is never what you end with because a lot of stuff just life be life, and you know
For
that, right?
sure, for
So
sure.
the sewing part is really our healing. We
Okay.
reflect on some of the issues that we're having. We're sewing as a family, so sometimes you air out a lot of family problems or family ideas, or then it's a sense of community because you can't make a suit by yourself. So
Nothing
you
like that. No, right.
involved in that process of creating a suit. So if somebody tell you they made a suit by themselves in one year, they're either lying or that suit doesn't look very good. So the healing part is really the congregation, the meditation, the involving of family, and being able to work out family situations during healing, or during that sewing process, or even involving a community. So that's one of the parts of the healing process for me because it's helped me. 26 years I've been in it. It really has helped me spiritually.
Hmm.
Talk. be disciplined and patient. And it taught me how to deal with meditation before I even knew I was meditating.
Right.
So that part for me is where it all ties in as it relates to today's experience.
I respect that. Other question we had is, what do the children do while the adults are sewing?
Well, if I have 8 children in my nation, which is about probably 13, 14 people, maybe 14, they have to touch the beads. They have
Okay.
something, whether it's stringing up or because remember, it's about paying up the homage, and that shouldn't be easy, or everybody will be doing it. So
Yeah. Right. Right.
children does help. I have a young lady who I was very proud of this year. She sold a lot of her own suit, and she was only 8 years old. So
Okay.
that's what the children are doing. Even though the adults or their parents are assisting them in a lot of ways because it's very elaborate suits if you want to be with us, because we the best in the world.
Hey.
But the children have to do something. And just the children being around and you telling those old stories and them listening, because basically the chief is like a griot.
Yeah.
You
Yeah. Yeah.
know, he's telling stories during the whole sewing sessions and the kids are listening and then you're actually teaching in that moment as well.
Yeah.
It's inspiration or letting them have their own artistic expressions and talking about family, how important family is, how important community is, how important culture is, and being able
Right.
to express culture. So you have a lot of that going on during that process. So the sewing experiences is where the healing come in for us.
Okay. Thank you for that. A couple more questions. Do societies or nations focus on Carnival all year, or are they involved in other activities throughout the year?
There's 3 times they come out, and
All right.
most are based on some of the same things because this culture, remember, started out of resistance. You
Yeah.
know, allowed to do Mardi Gras, so
Did
it's a
our own
culture.
shit. Right. Right.
Exactly. So the other time we come out is called Super Sunday, and it was based on I don't know if I guess you guys are familiar with urban renewal, and
Yeah.
did all over the country, and specifically to New Orleans, we had a black similar to a Black Wall Street, where you had all these African American businesses on Claiborne Street, which is the longest street in New Orleans. It runs
Hmm.
from parish, and we don't have counties, we have parishes, right?
Yeah.
And so they decided in the late 60s to build an overpass right
I-10.
on Claiborne Street, which brought, the people over the businesses,
I heard
so
about that.
yeah. So we had protests of that overpass, even though they did it, and that protest was a soiree, and it was about the children and lining up in the streets and doing this protest procession that turns into. We had a freedom rider. His name was Jerome Smith that started it, and
Okay.
we have a major chief in our culture. That his name was Allison Tootie Montana, and that was Jerome's mentor
Okay.
on the chief. So when he got involved in the protest, that's when most of the nation started being a part of the protest. And they call that Super Sunday. And it wasn't announced.
Hmm.
They would just put the word out to the chiefs, everybody would show up, and we would do this procession.
Dig it.
And people started finding out and it became popular. So now they have a date for it.
Hmm.
Then Uptown started doing it. And then it became Uptown Super Sunday and Downtown Super Sunday, which
Hmm.
took the narrative away of it being a protest of that bridge. So now it's just this, big festival, I would say, uh,
Right.
that goes on every year in New Orleans.
Right.
And it's always the third Sunday after Carnival Day for us.
Okay.
So it's Uptown, down. So that's the other times that we come out. And that's another reason why we don't destroy the suits anymore.
Right. Right. Can you imagine doing a suit for each? Yeah. Wow. Right. People's fingers would shrivel.
And
So
one other time we come out is called St. Joseph Night. Remember, we use European holidays
yeah.
to match,
Right.
right? And St. Joseph is big, really heavy here because once again, under the Code Noir, we had to be Catholic. So many Africans that's born in New Orleans are mostly Catholic, even though we still keep our same African traditions as well. But most of us are Catholic. So St. Joseph is another time that we come out. And we come out at night during that time. And it's
Hmm.
only the nations, right? Because on Super Sundays, sometimes you have the brass bands and all of that stuff
Right.
involved. But for St. Joseph night, it's only the nations. So that's the three times that we come out every year.
I love that. And you talking about the Code Noir. We had Sister Valerie Coron last night, and she's in Bahia right now. So she
Wow.
talked about how slaves in Bahia or enslaved humans in Bahia had to be Catholic, but that's where Candomblé came from because
Yeah.
they kept the Orishas in their practices, and but it was underground, and then it came out as Candomblé.
They hid it around behind the saints,
Right,
Like
right,
Santeria, it's
right,
by tradition that's brought through Catholicism, so they're able to still practice their culture, even though they're being in another part of the world.
right.
Same thing.
And yeah, that is healing too because you're taking the poison of the oppressor and making it your medicine.
Exactly. Like capoeira.
Hey,
Really, the last piece, they had
you think I'm
eight
just dancing?
fingers in the toes, and when the master came around, they got the berimbau and made it
Dun, 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 dun. Right.
so it's
Yeah,
our masking, it's also our masking ancestral worship.
right.
So
Right. Couple more questions is do you have any book references so people can do their own research or anything that you would recommend just quickly and then we'll because we're going to have a resources thing that we're going to send email afterwards, but is there anything top of mind that people can check out?
one thing I learned about African tradition, it's oral traditions.
Totally.
And the danger with that is when you don't document, people may document for you, and that documentation doesn't have to be accurate, right?
I mean, right.
So as a practitioner, you know how much stuff I see online about me that I didn't even know.
For sure.
So I'm saying that to say a lot of the stuff is what you read, just like they call us Mardi Gras Indians, right? That wasn't a name that we called ourselves. They
Right.
saw us Mardi Gras Day, which is carnival for us, and they figured that we part of the Mardi Gras tradition, but we have
Right.
zero to do with Mardi Gras. So they started calling us Mardi Gras Indians. And that's what I mean by documenting, because people started documenting books about us.
Right.
So the name was brought to us. So
Sure.
in order for people to understand traditionally what it is that we're doing, we had to go with the narrative.
Right.
Just like the whole narrative of what they call Native Americans and the African or the black ancestral part of Native American history um, is controversial. So um, even with that, we had to go by what the book said, or
Sure.
people joined those nations as Europeans, and they started the Indian councils, and when you passed away, the land went to the European ancestry, right? To where most of the Africans who were quote unquote Indians were kicked off the rolls, and now you have this whole narrative of DNA wise,
Right.
the African presence in the Native American community. So,
Right.
so a lot of different stuff that's going on that we're trying to clear up the myths, but we have some references as books. One is called The Haitian Influence of Antebellum America. And I
Okay.
think Alfred N. Hunt. Um, we have another one by a good friend of ours. Her name is Freddie Williams Evans, and it's called Congo Square, right?
All
Um,
right.
and actually, the French version of that, Naima, is on the cover of it.
Okay.
Some of the dances that they did in Congo Square called a calendar. But it's called Congo Square African Roots in New Orleans. Freddie Williams Evans, PhD. Right.
Okay.
Kwabena. Oh, it's forwarded by Kwabena. That's interesting. So that's another book. And then there's another doc. I don't know if you can find this documentary film anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Maurice Martinez.
All
He did
right.
a film called Black Indians. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
very interesting. I think some of the stuff I was just mentioning about as it relates to African Americans being part Native American, because
Right.
there's a lot of DNA stuff going on right now, right? So so those Africans who were kicked off the rolls, if you rebelled against uh signing up the treaties and going to the reservations, they didn't do DNA markers for you.
Sure.
So
Okay.
all of the Africans who have Native American DNA, it's only the five civilized tribes that did.
Okay.
So if you didn't agree with the treaties and went to the reservations, then they didn't do DNA markers. So all
Mm.
of the Black Indians in New Orleans became quote unquote African Americans. You got it?
Interesting. Sure.
And very interesting point because it confuses Native Americans.
Right.
And that's where it's this back and forth with that. But the way we stay out of it is remain true to those African traditions that was native to Louisiana and just roll with that.
That's what's up.
Right. And if anybody, want to challenge that, then I'm open and welcome to
Bring it
their
on. Right.
educational experience.
Couple more questions, family. So, can you speak to how toward the spectators and how their energy contributes to the energy of the battles and the masquerading and the whole process? So, the role of the spectators as judges, but just as viewing y'all doing y'all's thing.
Well, what wins the battle is your what they call fire in a hole, your game, right?
All right.
Spectators. They're tranced out, man. Because sometimes I see pictures or video of myself on Carnival Day. I don't remember any of it because
Right.
you're tired because you've been sewing up 3 days
And this thing is,
and you got this crown on. Once they do the crowning of putting that crown on, it's a whole spiritual experience that you deal with being experiencing that whole process, that whole year of stuff
yeah,
that you went through. Once you complete that by being crowned, you almost turns into this, you in that zone to
yeah,
where
yeah,
you
yeah,
just out there off adrenaline. You don't know what's going on. And I think with the drums, you remember the music, song, and the dance, the drums and the chants being a part of that as well, it also
yeah.
trances your your entourage. So we all just
Okay.
in trance that give you that energy that's so spectacular on the streets once you out of the suit and really look at it. It's a
Right.
very, very humbling experience,
That's
so
beautiful.
interesting.
Right. So, a couple more questions. So, for the nations, are they primarily family lineages, or how do people join the nation? Are they selected? How does that process work?
And that's a very, very good question because it's becoming a problem with some of the stuff. Because normally it's family that's passed on to family, right?
Right.
So if you're a chief or your mother or father was a chief, they would pass it on to the son or the daughter. The only problem with that is you may have somebody in the nation that's been there 30 years. So the chief's son may have been involved 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Feel me? So if
Mm-hmm.
the chief passes it to his son, you got a problem on your hands. One, the son may not know the full
Right.
tradition because might have been in college, and went away or wasn't involved as a child. So some nations have issues with that. The
Mm.
other part of being a part of the nation is you become a chief by running those positions through tenure, many many years. Like I was in the nation for 17 years before I became a chief of my
Mm.
nation because that nation retired.
Right.
But they gave it to me over some family members because I had been there the longest. And
Okay.
sometimes that can become controversial or can be
Sure.
a problem, even though I eventually started Goldenfeather and didn't take that route. But
Right.
you're asked in, you can't just join. You have to be asked in by the chief uh,
Mm-hmm.
to become a part of the tradition. But mainly it's community and family, close members.
Couple more. And thank you for just your openness and sharing this with us. I mean, like I said, I got notes for days. And so I'm showing tremendous discipline and asking other people's questions because I got, anyway. Um, so I'm trying to read through these quick so I can get, anyway, let me stop. Come back to your host duties, Reggie. All right. So Catherine asks, I often hear from Black American loved ones and African born loved ones about problematic dignity violations where Pan-Africanism is not present. So if any of Kathleen wants to know if your any of your Maasai or Meru connections come to join you um, in this process.
Well, I can answer that. What I've learned just traveling to Africa, north, south, east, west, central, um, there's certain folk from Africa that gets to America.
Right.
And the ones that get to America are quite different than the ones that stay home and stay in their communities. It's almost it's like somebody from the country that moves to the city versus
Totally.
that's born and raised in the city, right?
Right.
So we just get a taste of their cultural traditions a lot of times when they're from Africa and come to America because they're trying to, one, assimilate,
You're just
two,
trying to survive. Right.
they're trying to survive, right?
Yeah.
So I found in going back to Africa every year, we sow with the Maasai and the Meru, it's a different experience. And they actually enjoy those cultural connections as it relates to beadwork. So they're looking forward to seeing the final product of what we do that they help us construct.
Oh, that's cool.
Because a lot of times you know it's done in pieces. It's over 250 pieces, but it has to be flat because you can't assemble it there and get it to America. So
Right.
we have to assemble it when they get here. So we find that they very, very involved, they respect the culture, and they like what they're learning about their African traditions that were born in New Orleans.
Okay.
It's another thing, because Africa lives in a different way in different parts of the world under different circumstances.
Sure.
They just like the fact that Africa is being spread to different parts of the world and appreciated and innovated, you know,
Hmm.
because what is culture? Culture is a way of life, you know, and that changes depending on where you go, the circumstances you under,
You're right.
so that changes. So tradition is a very tricky word, because tradition sometimes changes, you know, and also they just like the new ways of sewing, and you got to be careful with that because they can like it so much to where they want to do what you're doing, and then they'll stop doing what they're doing. So we kind
Right.
of balance, like, no, man, keep your stuff. You're like, no, we want to do this. No, keep your stuff. Because
Yeah.
innovate, the culture becomes lost, the tradition becomes lost.
Right.
Challenge of us just keeping them focused on, you can learn other stuff, but keep your tradition.
Keep the tradition. Right. Right.
Mhm.
So last question before we wrap it up is from Brianna. It says when media and entertainment mainstream media share about cultural practices, how does that land for you? And she's talking specifically about sinners, talking about the Delta culture and Louisiana culture. So when that goes mainstream, what how does that land for you? Do you feel it gets lost, or just what are your thoughts on that?
Uh, I have a piece that's coming out on CNN in August during the 20-year anniversary of Katrina, right?
Mhm.
I've learned when I do interviews to speak in sound bites because what I find is New Orleans culture didn't, as it relates to Black Carnival traditions of New Orleans, for many years it never left. This is the sacred grounds. So for tourism, if you didn't come to New Orleans and go to the off the beaten path of New Orleans and
You know
see it,
about it.
never know it exists, right? So after Katrina happened, we were displaced in different parts of America, and they realized that people were coming here for the culture. The question is, what is the culture?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
200-year-old houses, and in Europe, there's 800, 1,200-year-old houses, right?
Right.
That is Cajun, which is very different than Creole.
Creole.
Gumbo is, red beans and rice is different than Creole and Cajun culture is slightly different, even though they
Right.
interchangeably, because one have red beans and rice and the other doesn't, right?
Right.
So what's Cajun and what's Creole is distinctively different, and a lot of people don't know that.
Don't even right.
What I'm saying to say is, after Katrina, they started really spreading the true off the beaten path cultures of New Orleans. One,
Mm-hmm.
they wanted to get us back. Two, they wanted tourism back. So for the first time, people realized that tourism in New Orleans, which is the food,
Right.
music, and the traditions, right? It had
Mm-hmm.
a lot to do with blacks in America, in New Orleans.
Right.
As it relates to the food, the gumbo and all of the traditional jambalaya and the etouffee and all of that stuff.
Right.
Pralines or pralines or clarines, you know, they don't come from France.
Mm-hmm.
But I see a lot of times they say pralines is a French candy. I'm like, go to France and try to find a praline. So that was the black folk that took that sugar
Yeah.
and took pecan trees and created this really nice.
Delicacy. Right.
We call it plyrine. And
Mm-hmm.
believe it or not, plyrine, and it's a word that they say for candy in Haiti. They say plowing. So it shows you, culturally how we've been on the back burner when truly the true essence of New Orleans culture that started out of Congo Square, whether as it relates to music or that gumbo of bringing the indigenous, the natives, the Africans from north, south, east, west, and central together to create the music, the food, and the traditions.
Right.
So what I'm saying is, um, that's where we really make sure that when we doing interviews and doing stuff like that, we speak in sound bites, because a lot of times we'll do interviews about Goldenfeather, and they would say, when the article come out, it would say Mardi Gras Indians, and
Mm-hmm.
they tell them we New Orleans Indigenous Masculine Societies. But they won't change that word because Mardi Gras is a very, very powerful, heavy tourism draw.
Yeah. Right.
And they don't want to go back to, something that people are not familiar with, and create something that's the truth, because sometimes the truth don't sell.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, one other thing I'll say before we close is I appreciated your one of the things I study in my personal historical study is the sanctity of marooning,
Got you.
right? So to go away, so when the system is so toxic for you, you have to find refuge in something else and use that as a healing mechanism. So like especially in our current circumstance, the government be doing what the government do. So like marooning, figuring out ways to find safe harbor and culture and learn from one another. I appreciated your articulation of marooning from a historical concept in New Orleans because that's kind of the work that I do is like, look, it's okay to step back a bit and take care of yourself and create healing communities when you being attacked by the master culture, so to speak. So I appreciated your articulation of that.
Got you. And also, I respect your knowledge and wisdom and understanding as well, because just your articulation and your speaking ability about this subject matter, it gives me some hope as it relates to there's a lot of us around that's that's speaking to that fact. And it's just that we got to just come together and figure out how we can make a bigger impact,
Right.
at least to our culture. Because I always say, because your culture is different, don't mean it's better than anyone else's.
That's
It only
real.
different. So we just have to learn, about each other and how we live and how we heal in order to make this thing full circle. to where we can have peace on earth.
Thank you, Chief Shaka Zulu, for sharing your wisdom and reverence with us. And what I did when you were giving your presentation, so I put up a new gong because you were talking about your Shango suits. The name of this gong is Shango.
Gucci man, great.
Yeah, so I'm gonna hit Shango once. We'll fade to black. And just thank you so much, Chief Shaka Zulu, for your wisdom. Deep bow to Miles and Jessica and Kripalu's production team. We'll be back at 3 o'clock with Michelle Cassandra Johnson. Let me get back to Shango. We'll play the gong and be out. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
For sure. Peace be with you all.